I will now ask that you all join me in reciting the four-way test. There we are. Thank you, Skylar. Number 1, is it the truth? And number 2, is it fair to all concerned? Number 3, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And number 4, will it be beneficial to all concerned? Thank you, Skylar. All right, and at this time, I ask any Rotarians who have invited a guest to please raise your hand so that you can introduce your guest to the club. If you're a visiting Rotarian who came on your own, please raise your hand and introduce yourself or let us know that you're here in the chat box. And Carol, who's helping with our guest today, do you see that we have any guests with us?
I don't see any hands raised and nothing has been put into the chat box.
All righty, thank you, Carol. And of course, thank you to all of our members for joining us here today for another Zoom meeting. I want to start by thanking all of you who were able to attend the Major Donor Appreciation event for the Project 2020. That was on Thursday evening. We had the opportunity to go out and see the finished product at the Morrison Child and Family Services, and it was incredible. I'm excited to share with all of you that it blew away my expectations. The pictures I had seen were not able to do it justice. It is much larger than I expected. And the entire space was so thoughtfully put together.
And can I do a shout out for Al? Because when we first had the idea, it was about half the size, and Al inspired me and said, Drew, for goodness sakes, just raise more money and make it bigger. And we did. And it's amazing. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Drew. And you can see that smile on Drew's face. I mean, that's the real deal right there, how excited he is and the lives that we're changing of all of those children. So like I mentioned, it's much larger than I expected, thoughtfully put together, and this project literally created limitless possibilities for children that use the space on a daily basis. Project 2020 was a huge success, and I want to take a moment to recognize Darren Hahn and Jana Cole for leading the effort on this project. Before we take a moment to applaud them, I also want to recognize everybody else that spent time helping in the planning and collecting money, and to everybody that donated to the project. The impact this project will have over the next 50 years is truly special, and that's what Rotary is all about. Over the years, our club has had several of these large projects, and they exemplify what our club is about. Before this project started, Rotarians expressed that our main priorities were the youth and homelessness. This project will have a huge impact on countless lives of Portland's youth. The impact on these underprivileged youth is proactively helping to prevent future homelessness. Thursday's event was a very proud Rotary moment. So again, let's please give a round of applause for Darren, for Jana, and everybody that contributed in one way or another to the project. And additionally, a special thanks to Maria and Maggie and Skylar for their efforts in putting together the appreciation event on Thursday and making sure all of our donors understand the impact that they are making. So thank you to each and to all of you. All righty, and on to our birthdays. As the month of September comes to a close, I'd like to take one last opportunity to wish a very happy birthday to all of the Rotarians who have celebrated their birthday in this month. Please make sure to take note of the Rotarians and be sure to wish a happy birthday to each of them. Reach out and let them know that you're thinking of them. All right, thank you, Skylar. And now I would like to welcome Rotarian Phil Levinson, who will be presenting this week's reflection. Welcome, Phil.
Hi, I was just thinking about the reflection I've put together and thinking about Drew's comment about the Morrison Center and our project. And he had a small scale project and somebody suggested trying just a little bit harder and look how much you achieved. And it also fits with serving to change lives. And the reflection is a quote that I found from Jimmy Carter. It just popped up on my screen one day. Our dreams are big, our hopes are high, our goals long-term, and the path is difficult. But the only failure is not to try. and that so exemplifies Rotary. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Phil. That was a wonderful reflection. Right on time, right on cue. Perfect. I love it. So thank you so much, Phil. And if anybody else is interested in giving a reflection in the future, you can reach out to Susan, who is in charge of scheduling the reflections. And her email is twonavycaptains@gmail.com and will be dropped into the chat. Thank you, Skylar. Okay, now it is time for a breakout room with a few of your fellow Rotarians. So when you enter the breakout room, please introduce yourselves to the others in the group. And about a minute before you come back to this main meeting, you'll get a notification that the breakout room is ending in about 60 seconds. As always, you are more than welcome to chat openly with your fellow Rotarians, but if you need a topic of discussion for today's breakout room, I want to encourage each of you to tap into a little optimism. I don't want to be naive to how difficult the pandemic has been on many of our members and community members, but I do want you all to discuss your favorite parts about being locked down. Think optimism here. Like, for instance, for me, I got to spend a lot of time with my new son, and that was an absolute gift. And so again, I don't want to be naive. I know how difficult and how many issues this pandemic has caused, but let's take a moment to reflect on the positives. Okay. Well, we will see you all back here in about 10 minutes.
All right.
Great conversation in your breakout room and enjoyed the opportunity to interact with your fellow Rotarians. And now please welcome the program committee chair, Dev Dion, as your chair of the day. Welcome, Dev.
Thank you, Reed. It's my pleasure to introduce Abby Engers as our speaker today. Abby is a past member of our club and has a fascinating background. She works for Boly Welch. She's a consultant with them and also does recruiting. But she's been at Boly Welch 6.5 years. Prior to that, she was an attorney and worked in the workers' compensation area. She is a voracious reader. She reads, she said, 120 to 150 books a year. So if she's not taking care of her child or sleeping, she's reading. And those are all sorts of books. She's also mother to a 1.5-year-old, and she bikes to work and back. And I asked her if she biked to work yesterday, and she said no, fortunately. But Abby's going to tell us about what's going on in the job market and recruiting and everything in these COVID times. It's my pleasure to introduce Abby Engers. Abby.
Thanks so much, Dev. Yeah, so recruiting in unprecedented times. And excuse me, I am an extremely fast talker, so I might get through this a little bit more quickly than I intend to. But this is basically an informed hypothesis that I have about what's going on. And thank you for inviting me to talk to you about the hiring market. It's definitely a juicy topic right now, thanks to the pandemic. And even before the pandemic, COVID has really wreaked havoc on the hiring market. You might have seen like a slew of articles discussing how all these businesses are struggling to hire and unemployment so high. And with unemployment so high, there's this what's going on here? And a lot of these issues actually really predated COVID. I don't know if y'all remember, but in like February 2020, the unemployment rate was 3.5%, which was a 50-year low. And so there's been stress in hiring and recruiting for a while, and this kind of like just blown it open. And there's a few narratives that have been going on. And so I work as an HR consultant. And so I've had several businesses that I work with ask, in the last 18 months, like, what is going on here? We've never had this much trouble hiring anybody. There's this like dearth of candidates. Our applications have slowed so much. We're seeing, 30%, 50% less people applying for roles. And, is it the unemployment benefits? Everyone always comes back to, is it the unemployment benefits? But honestly, that's really not what the market's shown. So 25 states ended unemployment benefits earlier this summer. They really did not have any really difference in their hiring versus hiring in states that continued with benefits. So if it's not unemployment benefits, keeping people from sending in their applications to all of these open jobs, what is it? And so this is my informed hypothesis, which is based on the available data out there, my HR consulting practice, and also personal anecdotes that I've heard from both candidates and clients through work. So welcome. Okay, so what is going on? And there's really three main factors that have caused this disconnect in supply and demand between the supply of available workers and the demand of employers trying to hire them. And the first is that there's just less workers. The second is that there's a mismatch in supply and demand, which is also known as the value of a job to an individual, as well as the value of the job to the employer, and then which candidates and which jobs are available. So it's really two different things. And then lastly, it is still a pandemic. And we'll go into all of these, but so basically, I'll start with number one. There's just fewer workers. The US shed about 9 million jobs between February 2020, which was an all-time high for the United States workforce, and February 2021. So we've bounced back a little bit from them, but we were at an all-time high of 164.6 million, and we've regained a lot of those jobs, but COVID really lowered the trajectory. So, 2020, they were predicting X number of jobs. We were supposed to be up here. Instead, we're down here. We've lost jobs and we lost that trajectory. So it's two different things that's lowered that. But we currently have about 161.8 million people in the workforce as of August 2020. It's a pretty current statistic. And that's 2% lower than what was projected before COVID. And so in addition to these jobs that we've lost directly, the jobs that weren't recovered from that February to February, there's also jobs that have changed due to the trajectory. And essentially there's 5.7 million jobs that were, lost. And for our purposes, the important point is there's about 3.5 million people that, but for the pandemic, would be working a job. So who are those people? And, about 1 to 2 million of them are older workers. You might consider them, boomers. And those people have either retired early or they've stopped looking for work. And so there's an estimate that about 3 million more older workers would still be employed if the pandemic didn't happen. And there's a couple factors going on there. COVID fears is definitely one of them. COVID's definitely hit older populations a lot harder. The rise in the stock market has caused a rise in 401k value. And so a lot of people can retire earlier. They have the financial security and are ready to go. And a lot of people have gone through kind of like an existential crisis. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But it's also a feeling of some of the workers that I've talked to feel like it's like ageism. They worked in a job for a really long time and they can't get back in. People are not valuing their skills the way they should be. And then the other huge factor are parents. And this is not really a parent issue. It's really a mother issue. There are about 1.8 million women who dropped out of the workforce since the beginning of the pandemic. And the recession you might have seen has been called a she-cession. It's really affected women a lot more than men and really affected fathers disproportionately disproportionately affected mothers to fathers, right? So there are basically 2.3 million less women than we were on track to add. And this is the lowest level of participation that we've had in 30 years. And this is actually really, really sad because the saddest part about all this is that in December 2019, so right before COVID hit, women for the first time in our history held over half of the jobs. So this has been a huge blow to women in the workforce. And why mothers, right? And it's basically this failure in childcare as well as a work culture that typically rewards fathers as breadwinners and sees mothers stereotypically as less dedicated or less reliable and has limited flexibility for them when they are forced to pick up the slack of things like, my child's tested, someone in my child's daycare is tested positive. I need to take, 2 weeks off, and there's less flexibility for those people. And this is one I personally have experience with. My kid was born on March 4th, 2020, about 1 week before we went down to lockdown. And we were unable to secure childcare for her until October 2020. So luckily, Boly Welch is a company that was thrilled to have her on Zoom calls. And I had a really flexible schedule and they embraced that. But this is a major issue for a lot of families. In Oregon, we have about 2.1 million folks in the workforce, and about 40% of those folks have kids, and about 350,000 of those folks can't work remotely. They might be cashiers, doctors, dental hygienists. They have kids. They don't have childcare. And so that's about 350,000 people in Oregon that basically are unavailable until childcare is. And childcare really just isn't available. There's in Portland, it's estimated that there's about 1 spot open for every 3 kids. And that's also true regarding other kinds of care, like elder care. There's, a shortage before. And then with the restrictions, like the safety protocols that COVID has caused, and then this generally low pay that's made these jobs less desirable, because there's so much contact, which is why they approved the 3rd booster for childcare workers as well. This has really tanked an industry that was already very stretched before COVID. And so, we're basically down several million people as a nation, thanks to those 2 groups alone. But there's other, groups that are also struggling, which leads us nicely to our next issue, which is supply and demand. And so the recession caused by the pandemic is unlike other recessions that we've experienced as a nation. You think about the Great Depression, you think about the Great Recession, long periods of time where people are getting laid off. And so there's this workforce pool that's building up. Not the case with the pandemic, where some industries like the travel industry, hospitality, restaurant, totally walloped at the beginning, lost something to 60 to 70% of their workers. And they've made really impressive rebounds, but some industries, like recruiting, for example, very little impact and massive gains after that. So you have this disproportionate, the losses aren't experienced the same in all industries. And so there isn't this ever expanding pool in every industry where workers are just becoming more and more available. We're still at that February 2020 low for unemployment. And so this is not a normal recession, which means that we're still in this very tight pre-pandemic labor market. And, you might have seen, there's 10 million open jobs and there's 8.6 million unemployed folk. There's so many jobs, so many unemployed folk, like what's going on here? And part of that's just mismatches, right? So if you need to hire a tech person and a bartender has been laid off, which happened at the beginning of COVID, that's not really a potential hire, at least not right away. The bartender has to reskill. Maybe they have to learn to code, for example. And because the COVID pain of layoffs was felt very unevenly, some industries like utilities, transportation, you might have heard there's a shortage of school bus drivers, professional services, delivery, warehousing, supply chain, all of these are at new highs. There's ever increasing demand. And if your applicants are not fitting those requirements, for example, do they have a commercial driver's license? Okay, there's a mismatch here. And there's also a big mismatch in location for a lot of places. A lot of people moved out of cities into suburbs and exurbs. And so a lot of people just moved generally. And it looks like we have something in the chat. Yeah, totally. Even jobs that are feasible from work from home, there's just not that much grace given to parents, especially mothers who disproportionately were doing this care work while they were also working. Okay, so with the value of a job, and I'll take questions at the end. I have a couple things to get to, but I'll definitely answer all these questions. The value of the job is that the pandemic has a little bit caused this existential crisis. And this is more anecdotal. This is me talking to candidates, directly, but I hear this from candidates all the time. Something's changed in their criteria. They want to work remotely. Their commute has to be shorter. They want more pay, the hours and pay and situation of the job. It's no longer worth it to them. And so, we're still in the pandemic. people are understandably very worried about health and safety, and the value of a job has been distinctly lessened by that. You know, people don't value the job as highly. Like a $15 an hour job where you're being exposed to a public, you know, all the time while community spread is very high, that's not a very appealing job for a lot of people right now. And I will offer as an aside, a lot of people like, oh, just offer remote work. Remote work will fix everything. But that's really not true. Only about 37% of jobs can be worked remotely, according to a University of Chicago white paper. You know, despite what everyone on LinkedIn is saying about just offer remote work, it'll change everything. Remote work. It's not this panacea. And also, when we're talking about that, the value of a job has lessened. A lot of people, their total personal income went up. Total personal income went up about 15%. During the pandemic, it's higher than it was. And then, you know, that's partly due to stimulus money, and that's partly due to reduced spending, but, you know, that's good news. The safety nets worked. You know, maybe that's where the unemployment money is coming in. But on the flip side, the pandemic is also increasing the value of being home, you know, especially when you have no childcare, elder care, sick care, all of these things that are disrupting your usual work. And, you know, so from the supply side, we have fewer workers, and the workers that we do have are a lot less motivated to take certain types of jobs, especially while they're feeling financially okay. They're reevaluating their motivations, and they're often performing caretaking responsibilities. And remember, this demand is high. 8.6 million unemployed folk. We have 10 million open jobs. So third, let's talk about that you know, high demand, which is also the competition. And so in Oregon, we bounced back fairly quickly in all of this. So after that initial lockdown, we regained about 2 out of every 3 jobs that had been lost by the end of spring 2020. That's like a pretty quick recovery. And this summer, 2021, has been like nothing I've seen in any of my time in recruiting or HR. So Oregon added the same number of jobs in the first 6 months of 2021 that it did in the 22 months leading up to the pandemic, right? So there are about 98,000 job vacancies between April and June 2021, and that's 50% higher than normal. We're usually somewhere in the range of between 40 and 60,000 job openings at any time. So we're about a lot higher than usual. And you know, in the national context, there were about 6.7 million hires in June 2021, and that's only ever happened twice in the last 20 years. You know, hiring that many people in a single month, and that was May 2020 and June 2020. So coming out of lockdown when we were at an all-time, you know, low. And so I keep coming back to this, but remember, there was 3.5% unemployment in February 2020 before the pandemic. And this was a record low. And then since June 2021, we've dropped from about 5.6% unemployment, and now we're at 4.9%. That was the most recent data that they released in Oregon, and that's without being fully reopened. And so recruiting is only going to get harder as that unemployment pool dries up to that 3.5 or maybe even lower. And also the unemployment pool doesn't count all people, only people that are actively looking for work. And it's much harder to pull people who are not currently like ready to be in the labor force out. So that's still going to get harder and harder. And then that's not all industries. Like accountants, you cannot find accountants. The available unemployment rate for accountants, it's like 1.7%. It's like very low. And competition has gotten a lot tougher. You know, this all equals less workers, higher than average pool. 95% of business leaders in a recent PBJ study said that it was harder to find workers for open positions now, and that's up from 18% in the beginning of the year. And, you know, all of this is a smaller than average pool. And according to that same PBJ study, about 57% of companies said that retaining talent was their #1 business goal, and that their top business challenges, their top 2 at, you know, over a third of businesses were available workers and staff turnover. So people are losing people on their team and they are unable to replace them. So then the competition just generally increased. You know, something like 40% of businesses have increased wages within the last year. and we're still in a pandemic, right? Nothing can really change in this equation until there are more available workers. So we have to get on the other side of COVID. We have to have more available childcare. School reopening might have helped that a little bit. The jobs need to be more compelling, and we need to have less community spread. We need to fully reopen. But what else is going on? There's some other things. So in the spring and summer of 2021, vaccines were becoming widely available and the case numbers were dropping. I think we can all remember like June, July, they were like, oh, 200 cases for the state. That's great. And there was a sense of reopening. Businesses were gearing up. I was getting a lot of calls then about, okay, return to work plan. How do we make this equitable? How do we open up the office again? What are the safety protocols that we're going to have in place for those offices that had been remote? And consumers and employees, we're getting a little bit like ready to go and return to normal, whatever that means. But we have Delta. And Delta and the other variants are making it really hard to change the conditions that are causing this pain for employers. And because many of the jobs can still be done remotely and the conditions are mismatched, there's more and more opportunities out there. But there's a sense of disconnection, and this is all anecdotal, but I can tell you that a lot of candidates that I've talked to stop responding, or they'll start a job and decide after 2 weeks that they don't really like it, they'll quit. So we're seeing a lot more ghosting, which is when a candidate or a new employee just disappears. They ghosted. And so, it's October, almost October. Maybe they're leaning into spooky season, but it's just this disappearing without explaining why. And a lot of that's because this lack of connection where people aren't seeing their coworkers face to face every day. And so they're just, okay, bye, we're gone. And then in terms of quits, there's been a huge rise in quits. This peaked really in April of 2021, but quits surged about 13% this year to like all-time highs. And this is a little bit like people that did not lose their job at the beginning of COVID. They sheltered in their job. Things were getting a little bit weird. Things were changing. They weren't feeling that connection with their coworkers. And then after things started to, with the vaccines, kind of open up, there's kind of this like, oh, I feel safe enough to look now. And so people were confident enough. And so there was a huge increase in quits. And we talked a little bit about unemployment, but the 25 states that ended it early didn't see this huge change. And so, there's reasons for that in terms of increased savings, this mismatch in what employers and candidates are looking for in the available jobs. But these are all factors that are also increasing this pain. And so one of the things that I do is help companies solve these pain points. A lot of companies haven't really adjusted how they're hiring, and their clunky process dates back from really like the Great Recession, when there were so many candidates or too many candidates and people that were overqualified for jobs were applying to jobs, just because they just needed anything. And so the power dynamic in the employer relationship was very heavily favoring the employer at that stage. It has flipped completely the other way, but companies haven't really adjusted to that dynamic. And so, there's also, it's slow, it's clunky, they're asking too much of candidates. There's a lot of opportunities out there. So people are like, well, if not you, I'll get somewhere else. And there's just like this less of connection that leads to the ghosting. And they really thought about the candidate experience. So these are just a couple things that I think everyone can do. If you're an employer, if you have any open positions at all, these things will increase your applicant pool, increase the quality and quantity of applicants that you get. And the first is to rethink your requirements, and do what they did back before the Great Recession, which was hire on potential. Do you actually need to hire somebody with a college degree to do the job that you are hiring for? Or do they need to have 7 years of experience? Or could somebody who has 3 years of experience but is really motivated also do that role? And then what can you train on? A lot of employers don't really train employees anymore. They just expect them to come in, fully skilled up from their last position. And so really questioning, are the things that I'm asking for actually going to cause someone to be successful in this role? And the second thing to do is to sell the job. And this is very common, but a lot of people, when they're, posting their jobs or advertising their jobs, they take out this, 10+ year old job description, dust it off, post it. It's got, 20 6 bullet points with everything that you could ever do in the job and asks, can you lift 25 pounds? And that's not really compelling to somebody who's skimming through job descriptions. What is in it for them? And so I, ask the employers that I'm working with, okay, so what is the day-to-day like? Well, what are the unique benefits of this role? If you were pitching somebody on this role about the unique benefits and culture of your company, what would you tell them? And make every job description a sales pitch about why a candidate should want to work for you. The third thing you can do is make your applications frictionless. So many companies use things like applicant tracking systems, ATS, or have some kind of like convoluted multi-page application. Companies are requiring candidates to type in, their educational history in 15 separate text boxes. They're asking for references that they have no intention of calling, at this stage of the game anyways. And so there's so many steps. A lot of applications take, 20 minutes, an hour to complete, that a lot of people just quit filling them out halfway through. And so one of the things you can do to get more candidates is just to make your application shorter and ask for less. So if you make your application if you're able to fill out an application in 5 minutes or less, you'll increase the number of applications you get by something like 360%. Like, it's an absurd number. And so at this stage, when you're looking at applications, focusing on the information that you actually need to move someone on to the next stage, and only ask for that. You can always collect information about references or things like that later on in the process, but why ask it of people that you're never really going to consider for that first interview stage? Fourth thing to do is focus on the candidate experience. Give people updates. Be on time for interviews. I can't tell you how many candidates I get feedback, and I was like, well, I was waiting in the Zoom room for 10 minutes. Following up, thinking about what it feels like to be a candidate, because the power dynamic is so imbalanced when it comes to interviews. Really making sure that they have a really positive experience, because then they won't ghost, they'll stay with your company. And then the last part is just making jobs more valuable. So maybe this means increasing salary. Salary is not everything. It might also be offering remote or flexible options. It might be hiring people into stretch roles. It might be, increasing safety or stability. If you're in an industry that requires, interfacing with the public, or has, a lot of shifts that are at odd hours or odd times, just making sure things are more stable and secure. I mean, there's many ways to make a job more appealing, but obviously your employee base and your industry will dictate a lot of what makes jobs valuable. And I think companies are starting to pick us up and catch us on. Same Portland Business Journal, PBJ, study that 71% of companies were offering flexible or remote work. 61% were offering more benefits like wellness programs, and then 58% were offering training and career development, which is, for me, super positive. Like, oh, you're training your employees, so they'll stick with you. It's awesome. So those are some things you can do, but is the end in sight? And this is where my hypothesis is just my hypothesis. And maybe, if we can get the variants under control and really reopen childcare in schools, like, more widely available, but our return to normal is probably not what we're hoping for, which is this return to this employer favored market that we had after the Great Recession. The labor market favors candidates in the pandemic, and that is only going to make it, the pandemic's only made it worse. It was favoring candidates before the pandemic, and now it's exacerbated the issue. There's less older workers, there's less women, there's no relief in the future. There's not like this gush of new candidates entering the workforce. And there's been a declining birth rate. We've been down 20% in the last decade. It's been falling since 2007. And we experienced a 4% decline last year. It's a record low for births in the United States. And so, you've heard this in Rotary talks before. I remember some of these, but basically employers are really going to have to change their tactics and their mindsets if they're going to continue to have workers in the future. But, on a happy note, it will likely become easier with the increase in vaccination mandates that are going on. But that's kind of where we're headed, right? Like, we were in a tough spot before. The pandemic's made it a lot worse. It'll probably recover a little bit, but we're always going to have to be a little bit more focused on how to compete with other businesses that are hiring in a market where there's not enough talent. So I see that there's a couple questions that came in, but if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Abby. If anybody has questions, you can go ahead and put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. I know, Al, you had a question that you put in the chat.
Yeah, and the question was about whether, a couple generations ago, one breadwinner could have a middle class family status, and I think the cost of everything has gone up quite a bit. Housing's more expensive. Pretty much everything except for clothes have become more expensive. And there really is no place where, especially like the minimum wage has kept up, that a person could afford a 2-bedroom apartment on a minimum wage. And that's the minimum. And a lot of companies haven't really kept up in that way. That's made wages, like, I think the number that I saw was that wages have risen about like 12%, but costs have risen about like 50%. Yes, studies on the death rate in COVID and the job market, 700,000 lives. Yes, I agree that there's probably some impact on the candidate pool, although unfortunately a lot of the people that were affected were part of those, that older worker demographic that I was talking about, just because of who COVID is disproportionately impacted. But yes, absolutely. Like, that is a huge number of people that we've lost as a country. Yep, totally.
Deb has a question.
Go ahead, Deb.
Thanks. Abby, people like Amazon and FedEx and everyone and Walmart have announced they're going to be hiring hundreds of thousands of people for the Christmas rush and general growth. Are they going to be disappointed in who they are able to hire? And are we going to continue to see supply chain issues? The most recent one that bit me was pet food.
Yeah, we're definitely, and I was speaking a little bit outside my area of expertise, but yes, we're definitely going to see supply chain issues. One person that I know that works in supply chain was like, if you're ordering Christmas presents online, do it today. And that was like a month ago. As far as like Amazon and some of those like large corporations hiring hundreds of thousands of people at, in one go, their business models are a little bit different. So they pay way above market wages for what they do, maybe like $23 an hour for a driver, but they don't give them increases after a certain amount of time. And so they're expecting huge amounts of turnover, is how they handle it. And so, sometimes that salary, they've made the job attractive enough that people will sign on for the short term, but it's not a long-term fit.
Abby, Will has a question before you address Roberts.
Of course, yeah.
Hey, Abby, great presentation today. My question is, throughout history, we've had these shifts back and forth between labor and management, the power shift. I think you kind of alluded to that shift was happening pre-COVID, and that maybe COVID was just a catalyst for an acceleration of that. Do you see that as a big macro long-term shift now going forward?
I do. It's partially just the demographics of who's working. There was a study that came out a while ago that said, by 2030, millennials would make up 75% of the workforce. But when they were saying millennials, they really meant anyone under the age of, at that point, it was like 55, right? But 75% of the workforce is going to be under the age of 55. And we had these two very large generations, the boomers and their kids, the millennials, and then you have Gen X and Gen Z, and they're smaller. There's just like a couple million less people. I think it's like 8 or 9 million overall. But there's no one replacing them. So since 2007, the birth rate has gone down, and it's down 20%. And so now we're at a place where we are no longer at replacement levels. And so the replacement level would mean like, two people, a parent having a child would have at least 2.1 children to replace them. And our level for the last, 2007 doesn't seem that long ago, but it really is, has not been at that level, and it's really tanked. So I think these are trends that at least, for the next 20 years, it's only going to get worse. And we're not seeing, levels of immigration that would replace it. Like, I don't know where else we would find these workers from. So, there might be some automation that enables companies to replace some of the labor that they need. Maybe we find out, efficiencies or different ways to do things, but I can't imagine that it's going to really give in either in that direction, anytime in the future based on all the numbers that I know.
And Robert has a great question, I think.
Yeah, the mandatory vaccine may change the workplace. So my prediction is, and this is from a Portland company, right? So like in Oregon, I think this will just help us along on the path that we're already going on. I think we've already, the OHA announced today that we kind of reached the peak and we're going down. We're at almost 80% vaccination rates for, the people that are eligible to get it in Multnomah County. And so I think, we're kind of already on that trajectory here. And the mandatory vaccines will just push everyone along. Once again, this is anecdotal, but I talked to a lot of candidates who are in their, early 20s, and they're like, oh no, I haven't gotten vaccinated yet. I just haven't had the time. And so it's not because they don't want to, they just haven't or don't think it will affect them. And so that will probably push them along. We've been telling candidates for the last couple months, like being vaccinated makes you a more eligible candidate. Employers want to see that you're vaccinated. It's less of a liability for them. So my prediction will be like, it will help us along on a path that we should have been on before, but I think it will still take several, months to catch up, and we're really going to see some of the lessening in terms of like reopening next year, which is pretty unfortunate. But once again, outside of my area of expertise, that's just my informed hypothesis based on who I've been talking to.
This has been a really great presentation, and we all thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn it back over to Reed.
All righty, thank you so much. Round of applause for Abby. Okay, thank you so much, Abby. And next week, we will be meeting right here back on Zoom at noon on Tuesday. And please don't forget, if you have a speaker idea, please reach out to Deb Dion, who is the chair of our program committee. We are always looking for great program ideas, and our programs depend on our members taking the initiative. All right, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I want to thank Phil Levinson for today's very timely reflection. That fit in just perfect. Thank you to today's chair of the day, Deb Dion. You hear his name over and over during this program because he's stepping up and filling all kinds of roles. Thank you so much, Deb. And of course, thank you, Abby, so much for your presentation today. I especially enjoyed your presentation coming from somebody that just changed jobs. I don't know if everybody here knows that, but I was one of those statistics that she was just talking about here. I just recently started a new job. Here I am in my new office. We can talk about that some other time. Anyways, thank you so much for your presentation. And lastly, I'd like to thank everybody behind the scenes that help our programs run so smoothly. Thank you so much to Skylar. Thank you to Carol. Most importantly, thank you to all of our committee chairs and to our members for everything that you do. As we close today's meeting, let's all remember why we're here. We serve to change lives. Let's continue to focus on the lives that we change and continue to step up and do the right thing. Thanks again for joining, and this meeting is adjourned.